Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and the Boomsday Project is almost here, so I wanted to lock in my predictions for the best legendary minions of the set. Now, I already ranked all the legendary spells from worst to best, so now I'm going to be ranking all 13 legendary minions from worst to best. And some of these might surprise you, others certainly won't. And when I say worst or best, I mean the ones that are going to have the biggest impact, the most played cards, those meta-defining cards, those are going to be at the top. The ones we never see, they just don't find homes, those are going to be near the bottom. That said, let's go ahead and jump into the list. So up first here, I have Whizbang the Wonderful as the worst legendary minion in the Boomsday Project. And that's because Whizbang the Wonderful is not really even in contention for a list like this, because he's not a card you put into a deck. He's a card that completely changes the way you play the game. And although yes, theoretically, you could play Whizbang the Wonderful on the ranked ladder and find a little bit of success, I think it's going to be really challenging to do that. And it's kind of against the spirit of the list to even consider that, because we're talking about cards that build and create their own sorts of decks, and Whizbang doesn't fit that. So a pretty easy choice here for the worst legendary minion in the set for a competitive standpoint, but of course for fun, for new players, for people who want to enjoy some wacky stuff, Whizbang's fantastic. This is not a judgment on the card's design, merely its competitive nature. So up next here is the worst of the real legendary minions in Boomsday Project. We have Harbinger Celestia, new neutral legendary, and this is basically like a mirror entity with some stats attached to it. And like, whoa, that sounds kind of cool at first, right? Mirror entity's okay, stats are awesome. So when you combine the two, surely you must have a good card. But unfortunately, not really, just because ultimately, at the end of the day, Mirror Entity can be played around so easily. This is a 4-mana minion that costs more than a Mirror Entity. It very rarely ever does anything extra compared to a Mirror Entity. Like, occasionally, it might get to trade as a 5/6 if your opponent can't play anything good to negate it. But, 97% of the time right now, it turns into a Firefly or just some garbage cheap mech, and you don't get nearly the return on your 4-mana investment that you expect. And other times, you're probably not even creating that much friction for your opponent. So when this works really well, when it goes perfectly to plan, you just kind of match what your opponent does, and the rest of the time, you just spend a lot of mana on a card that doesn't give you very much return at all. So easy to play around, awkward to use, doesn't fit any sort of specific archetype or game plan. That to me means Harbinger Celestia just looks kind of unplayably weak right now. So that said, let's move on to our next card, Dr. Morrigan, the second worst of the real legendary minions. And this one's for Warlock, 8 mana, 5/5. With a Death Rattle, swap this with a minion from your deck. So the idea here is that Dr. Morrigan can be this like infinite possessed lackey where she just keeps bringing something out of the deck. You draw her again, you play her, she brings something out of the deck, etc., etc. But the problem there is that's like this super long-term value-oriented play that's so incredibly slow because she's just a 5/5 for 8. There's some deck building challenges there and consistency issues, because if you want to get something good off of Dr. Morrigan, you can't run cheap stuff, right? Possessed Lackey gets around that because it's specifically demons. So you can fine-tune what's going to be summoned from your deck much more easily and predictably. And beyond that, Possessed Lackey's 6 mana, so it's much easier to cheat out those big Void Lords like we've seen in the past. And frankly, even now, that's not a good enough Hearthstone play anymore. So Dr. Morrigan almost looks worse than the specialized, cheaper version Possessed Lackey. So although she does offer a unique angle and perspective in this pseudo-infinite value world, the speed issues there are just far too much for her to overcome. The awkwardness of building a deck is a challenge. So to me, Dr. Morrigan just looks like it's never going to work. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense and will ultimately fall short. So up next here we have Zerek, Master Cloner for Priest. And this one really suffers from a lot of the same problems as Dr. Morrigan, and then I think it's just going to be slow in how it impacts the game. So even if you can activate this Death Rattle consistently, which by the way I think is another problem, you're not always going to have time to get this Death Rattle to work or mana to get it all to piece together. That's a big challenge. But even if you do do, the stats just happen in multiple, turn after turn after turn. You're not going to be activating the death rattle multiple times per turn or anything crazy like that. So it's never going to be this big bomb of stats. It looks like it's going to take a while for the value on this death rattle chain to snowball up. And typically things that take a long time to enact in Hearthstone are weaker than things that happen quickly. There are other ways to get big piles of stats onto the board, right? And those big piles of stats win quickly with things like Spiteful Summoner we've seen in the past, for instance, right? That's because you get those 12/12s out right away and they're able to dictate so much influence. Zerek Master Cloner, all the stats, all the benefit is backlogged. It's going to take a while for it to impact anything. So that's a challenge for me, not to mention just finding a deck that is consistent enough in activating Zerek Master Cloner with a lot of targeted spells, but also not super reliant on Zerek Master Cloner, because you can't build a deck around one single legendary minion. If you don't draw it, you'll just lose. There's a real fine line to walk there as well from the deck building side of things. So to me, Zerek just seems like it's going to be a challenging card to really make a good swing turn or an impactful turn. And because of that, I just don't think it's going to see play. So up next here, we have Mecha'thun, of course, the most awesome neutral legendary of this set, without any doubt. And this one's all about this crazy alternate win condition where if you can basically exhaust everything you have, kill Mecha'thun, then you just win the game. And there are a few fundamental problems with this line of play and this strategy. Often, if you can achieve the condition here with Mecha'thun, you've probably already been in a good spot anyway, and Mecha'thun doesn't really help you win that much more anyway, because, for instance, you're a control deck who's lasted forever. So there is an alternate possibility here where you can play this with combo decks where you try to achieve Mecha'thun as a very specific win condition and build your deck in that way, emptying it with Myra's Unstable Element or Cataclysm, emptying your hand with Warlock, for instance. All these different things. And that's certainly a possibility, and that's why I ranked Mecha'thun above things like Zerek or Dr. Morrigan, because there's like this tiniest little chance that a combo deck actually works, but I do think it's the tiniest of chances, because often there are just going to be other combo decks that do it more consistently, faster, and better, so there's really no reason to play Mecha'thun, even if it's possible. If it's not the best version of that style of play, then it's not going to be a high-tier competitive deck. So even when Mecha'thun works well, I don't think it's really going to work all that well comparative to the entire world of Hearthstone. I'm holding out hope. Maybe somebody will figure out something crazy. The possibility's there. I just don't think it's going to happen. So next, let's talk about Subject 9, another neutral legendary minion here. I think the neutrals are probably a little weaker on average than the class cards, as we've seen a handful already. And with Subject 9 here, this is a very weird neutral legendary because it's only relevant for a certain batch of classes with Mage, Rogue, Paladin, and Hunter, and only barely relevant to Rogue because they don't actually have 5 secrets to be drawn. But beyond that, despite the fact that this is a really super efficient card draw attached to a body, right? It's like an Azure Drake that draws you 5 cards instead of 1. That sounds fantastic. And it could definitely see play in a deck that utilizes secrets, particularly Hunter with its Beast synergy seems to make sense. But the challenge for me with something like Subject 9 is that often playing secrets in Hearthstone has not been a great line to take unless you do something amazing like a turn 5 Spellstone from Hunter, or you cheat them out with like, Mad Scientist or Kirin Tormage, Mysterious Challenger, of course, a great example. That's when secrets are their strongest in Hearthstone. Like a mage spending 3 mana on a secret doesn't feel that good most of the time. And this card, essentially, if you built your deck for 5 secrets, you'd be drawing 15 mana worth of secrets that you have to play. Of course, you don't have to put 5 in. You could put 3 in and it will still draw you 3, and that would still be an incredibly efficient kind of play, but you still got to spend the energy to play those secrets. And maybe there's still a Kirin Tormage deck that works, and these all things sync up. I don't really know if I believe that. Mage already has a lot of good card draw options. And the problem with Hunter for me as a line here is that you want that Spellstone to happen on turn 5. And Subject 9 can't be played until turn 5. So if you draw Subject 9, you spend 4 mana on secrets to activate your Spellstone. You're looking at a turn 7 Spellstone, essentially, instead of that turn 5 Spellstone. And that's just not nearly as swingy or important in Hearthstone because those stats are going to be much more easily cleared by all kinds of different AoEs and just minion trades and so on and so forth. So ultimately, a card that from a raw value and stat and efficiency standpoint, it honestly looks off the charts. But when I think about putting it into practice and finding a deck for it and figuring out who wants to use it, it just comes up a little bit short. And frankly, it's a fine card. Everything on the rest of this list is going to be playable in my mind. These are all 3 or higher star cards, but just one with some challenges, so not as high on this list as some people might expect. And then up next here, we have Hunter's Boommaster Flark. And I guess this is kind of the new Dr. Boom of the set. It's a 7-mana card that summons a bunch of bombs. Specifically, these are Goblin Bombs, though, which in my mind are way worse than Boom Bots. The 0/2 stat line means they're very hard to activate, first off, because they can't attack. They can't trade in like Boom Bots of old could. And the 2 damage to face is often less useful as well than a Boom Bot, which could help clear minions, for instance, and play for more of a board-based strategy instead of a strictly face-based strategy, because Goblin Bombs only hit the opponent's face for 2 damage, in case you didn't know. And what that means is that for Boommaster Flark, I think there's always potential in a card that summons 5 minions. Like, that's just such an enormously big reload. And it also puts, theoretically, 8 unavoidable damage into play, which can be really important for Hunter. Those are good things, and that's why this card is not lower on the list. But it's still a challenge because essentially, these Goblin Bombs are good at doing damage and ending a game. They're also decent sometimes to absorb magnetic minions because they're a body that tends to linger around and can be played with a magnetic buff. The problem there, though, with Boommaster Flark is that as a 7-mana play, the magnetic line isn't as helpful because you've already kind of played out the early and mid portion of the game, and that's when magnetic's most influential, taking those early to mid value trades, just getting a big pile of stats out that your opponent can't deal with, creating those pressure scenarios. And by the time you get post turn 7, it's going to be a lot harder to make those magnetic pressure plays as relevant. So keeping these minions on board isn't as useful as it otherwise might be. So then it becomes about damage, and I'm not sure that you're going to be able to consistently activate that damage in time before your opponent stabilizes, counter pressures, heals, etc. So there's things to like about this card, but also some stuff that still falls short for me. And I've actually played this card now. I got to play it a little early. Some of you will be watching this video long after Boommaster Flark was released, but I am, although making a prediction, speaking from a little bit of experience with this one in particular. So I think it's gonna be tough, but again, maybe possible, just not a consistent everyday sort of Hunter card by any means. So up next here we have Myra Rotspring, and this is the Legendary Minion for Rogue, of course, and this one's all about discovering a minion, but also giving Death Rattle to the 4/2 base here for Myra herself. And it's an interesting little combination of things. I think most obviously this is designed for a Death Rattle Rogue archetype, but frankly, I don't think Myra Rotspring is limited to that. You can almost look at this like another Azure Drake style card, like we mentioned previously, where you play down a body for 5 mana, and it gives you a thing, a Death Rattle minion in this case, much worse than a card in your deck on average. A lot of Death Rattle minions just aren't very good. A lot of the Discover effects here are going to backfire. But then you also get this little upside of the Death Rattle being cast on Myra herself so that she summons some random minion or does some cool thing from the Death Rattle, right? There are opportunities for this to be a solid minion on board, almost like a piloted Shredder with even more potential upside than a piloted Shredder, because you could high roll into summoning 7/7s, for instance, off your Death Rattle, and that'd be awesome. So there are opportunities for Myra Rotspring to just be put into a deck as a mid-range minion. Just a little bit of a pressure on board sometimes, and a, maybe a Miracle Rogue, for instance, some sticky stats, some hand size resource generation. So I like all of those aspects. I don't think this will be a staple for Rogue. I don't think Death Rattle Rogue is going to make the cut. But this is one of those cards that's just going to hang around and be okay to play. We've seen that previously with some Rogue legendaries as well, where they were just like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. I'm just going to toss it in. And it ends up working out okay. And I think that's exactly the space Myra Rotspring is going to live in as well. And then up next here, we have Stargazer Luna. And this is another card I have a little bit of experience playing early. So although this is a prediction, there is some experience backing this conversation. And with Stargazer Luna, this one, of course, gives you a lot of opportunity to draw a ton of cards and basically chain top decks into resources, and I would say a lot of damage, or at the very least minion pressure as well. And if you build your deck correctly, Stargazer Luna can absolutely go off into some big chains. She can also backfire a little bit, of course, but if you play her consciously and you know what's in your deck, often you're going to get some fairly reliable results, drawing 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 cards off of Stargazer Luna. And frankly, even if she just comes with 1 or 2 cards, that's a pretty big return on your investment here because you're not sacrificing a ton in stats. And I'll also say that I felt fairly safe multiple instances playing my Stargazer Luna out onto the board preemptively and not necessarily having the instant card draw. So just playing her on 3, sometimes opponents can't deal with 4 health from hand on turn 3. You know, a 3 damage Eaglehorn Bow, for instance, is not going to answer your Stargazer Luna. And then you can really start to add up the value in the next turn when you have a full mana resource available. Now, this is not a great top deck from hand, of course, in a deck that's looking for tons of damage. But if you store this in your hand and wait for a situation in the late game where you need to top deck that Frostbolt into Frostbolt, Stargazer Luna can create those opportunities. So she gives you those Hail Mary plays. She gives you some consistent card draw in the early game sometimes as well, just where you can get that guaranteed Stargazer Luna into Arcane Missiles and you know you're going to cycle, clear the board a little bit, and have a solid minion on board. So she's both consistent but also high rolly, and those are really strong things to have in Hearthstone, and I think that's exactly why Stargazer Luna will make the cut in some sort of mage deck one way or another. So then up next here I have Paladin's Crystalsmith Kangor, and I think I'm much higher on this card than the average Hearthstone player. And there's a couple reasons for that. I think most people are getting really attached to Crystalsmith Kangor's effect here. Your healing is doubled, and downplaying the value of that effect to some extent. And in a lot of ways, I agree. I'm not sure how often that's going to matter. It can still be good, that Arcane Artificer sort of thing, where you play a cheap minion and you gain a lot of health. We've seen that work successfully. And frankly, with Paladin, it could lead to some pretty big heals very quickly. You know, Crystalsmith Kangor into Lay on Hands becomes a really stabilizing play in the late game, gets you resources. The problem is does that kind of Paladin deck work? There are so many other decks that are proactive and present win conditions. I don't know that those sorts of stall it out plans are great right now, but you never know. That's an opportunity for this card. The thing I'm more excited about with Crystalsmith Kangor is just that I think this is a solid 2-mana minion. It's essentially an Annoyotron that doesn't have Taunt, which it's going to be annoying to deal with, much like an Annoyotron was. But also this lifesteal gives it a lot of defensive potential. So not having Taunt, but having lifesteal gives it that same defensive line as Annoyotron. Beyond that, it's the best minion for buffs. It's perfect buffing territory. Much like we've seen with Righteous Protector or Argent Squire in the past, where you could give that Blessing and Might, take a value trade, kill a Tar Creep or whatever it might be. Crystalsmith Kangor does the same thing, but he has that additional upside of lifesteal, and not only that, but lifesteal that's doubled. So will an aggressive deck want to utilize that lifesteal? They probably won't care. Usually they don't need that too much. But a mid-range deck, a control deck that's looking to flex this in, or of course a buff deck like a Quest Paladin deck, all of those could use this pretty successfully. So my take on this is I don't really know that Crystalsmith Kangor is going to see play tomorrow. Like with the expansion hits, I don't think this is going to be a day one standout all-star card. But like 8 months from now, when you're looking back over the expansion, maybe another, or maybe expansion or 2 has come out, maybe a standard format rotation has happened, you're going to be like, oh man, Crystalsmith Kangor fits in a lot of different decks. And because of that flexibility, fast decks, slow decks, just because it's annoying for its stat line, the lifesteal is intriguing. All of those different elements meld together for me to a card that looks playable, if not super exciting right away, nonetheless, still a solid base to work with in so many different directions. So now we're into the top 3, and I think basically all 3 of these are as close to sure things as we've ever had in Hearthstone. And frankly, that you could put these in any order. I settled on this order. I like this order, but don't get stuck on these. They're all fantastic cards. So up first at the number 3 spot, I have Zilliax, the final neutral legendary minion that we're going to talk about. And this one's, of course, just the big mech bomb synergy card. It's the perfect mech finisher centerpiece. It's so cool in what it does because the magnetic aspect here means you get to put Divine Shield, Taunt, Lifesteal, and Rush all into play immediately. You get to attack with a Divine Shield minion right away thanks to that Rush. It gives you some survivability, stabilization thanks to the Lifesteal and Taunt. So it's this really interesting swing tool and defensive tool, honestly, that's perfect for any sort of mech deck. But frankly, even beyond mech decks, I think Zilliax has potential just as a minion, because it's not just when you magnetize this that it becomes good. even just as a minion, it's this interesting Argent Commander almost that has even more advantages and will still be able to take value trades, will still give you life, will still set up a defensive body. And then it also really empowers things like Corpse Taker, a card we've seen pretty successfully in Hearthstone a few times. It's worked well with things like Alakir in the past. Zilliax becomes this super Corpse Taker minion as well. Just run Zilliax Corpse Taker, you're good to go. You don't get Wind Fury, but you get Lifesteal, Divine Shield, and Taunt, all of which are fantastic. So clearly there are ways to play this in magnetic mech style builds. It's going to be fantastic, and there will be one of those that works. It's almost inevitable, so that's a guarantee. Lock that in. And then beyond that, it's a card that even if mechs fall out of favor, you might see this thing pop up from time to time just because it does cool things and it makes an impact. So for me, Zilliax, fantastic card, is absolutely going to be a big part of the Boomsday Project and makes it for the number 3 spot. And now moving on to my final 2. I had a really tough time determining which one went first and which one went second. I landed in this order, which I think reflects the community sentiment a bit too. And that's with Electra Stormsurge at number 2, which some of you will figure out number 1. I won't spoil it. This is the new Shaman Legendary Minion. And again, I think this is just an absolutely sure thing. Electra Stormsurge has an incredibly powerful battle cry here, doubling any spell you cast, essentially. So that's right. You can play Electra Stormsurge into Bloodlust, and all of your minions on board will have +6 attack, which is crazy. You can play it in a defensive deck, alternatively with Lightning Storm, and you get to clear a much bigger board than would otherwise be possible without having to utilize that extra card in hand, so it saves you on resources. And as you start to run through all of the Shaman spells, they basically all make sense. They're not literally all, but a lot of them make sense. The playable ones certainly all line up. So to me, it seems like aggro decks love this card. Control decks love this card. When you look at the stat line too, it's a totally reasonable stat line for the effect. You're not even sacrificing much if you just had to play this as a minion for tempo for some reason. You're still getting a 3-mana 3/3, which is okay. Beyond that, it's an elemental, so it works with elemental synergies as well. All of that to me means you've just got this perfect package that somebody's gonna love. It's gonna be the perfect fit in multiple decks as far as I'm concerned, and that's why Electra Stormsurge is going to be a solid card. Only even Shaman won't be running this thing. Any other Shaman deck will find a reason to play this one, I think, and that's why it's gonna be a fantastic card. And then finally for the number 1 spot, most of you saw this coming, it's Flobbidinous Floop, the new Druid minion, and of course this one has created just memes and hilarity and anger and frustration. That's because most people think Flobbidinous Floop is an incredibly overpowered card and is going to create a lot of scary opportunities for Druid, a class which a lot of people think is already overpowered. So it feels like Blizzard is kind of doubling down right now on the oppressiveness of Druid. And I have to agree, Flobbidinous Floop looks very, very strong. His effect, being able to copy a minion that was played on a previous turn, is just absolutely fantastic. Because what that means is you can play a 4-mana Malygos. You can play a 4-mana Hadronox. That's, by the way, a copy, so it's just an extra one. And, of course, a 4-mana Malygos means you can do a lot of damage in a single turn. And there's very little your opponent can do to disrupt it, too, because it's preemptive. You're playing it out, and it's ready to go. And it's nearly guaranteed outside of some crazy disruption opportunities. But it's same for Hadronox. Like, you just get this extra Hadronox that you can cube. It's like another Witching Hour almost in a way. That also, by the way, has tons of flexibility for other things. If you need it to, in a pinch, it can be a Lich King or a Ysera or some other crazy card. Like, yes, it'll be a 3/4, but so many cards have great effects that you're happy to get for 4 mana. So ultimately, the opportunity for Flobbidinous Floop is just off the charts. Like, there are so many crazy things you can do with this. Somebody's going to find a way to make it work in a deck. It's guaranteed. It's going to be a great deck. So really, at the end of the day, although Electra and Flobbidinous both look fantastic, I had to give the edge to this guy. He's super duper scary. I'm going to try to make him work like everybody else, and I guarantee you it will be fairly easy to do. So this, to me, is the number 1 legendary minion from the Boomsday Project. Flobbidinous Floop takes the crown. He will be the very, very best. And there you go, guys. That's my rankings for the Legendary Minions. I'm curious what you thought. Where would you put these cards? Which ones surprised you? Which ones were overranked? Which ones were underrated? I want to hear all your thoughts in the comments below. You guys have great insights, often better than me. So share your details. Share everything you have to say. I want to hear it all. The expansion's almost here. I'm super excited, so I can't wait to theory, craft, and guess and predict right alongside you guys. But you don't have long, so leave those comments and hurry. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.